The glass shattered against the wall, and every man at the table went silent. Daniel Hart stood with his hands still in the air, his chest rising and falling with anger he rarely let anyone see. Someone had refused him. Not a business partner, not a rival, not even one of his own men. A woman. And that had never happened before in his entire life. Daniel Hart was 38 years old, and by every measure that mattered in his world, he had everything. He owned half the buildings in the old part of the city. He controlled shipments that moved through the harbor every night. He wore suits that cost more than most people made in a month, and he never once had to ask twice for anything he wanted. Women had always come easily to him. Some wanted his money, some wanted his power, and some simply wanted to feel safe standing next to a man that other men feared. Daniel had stopped keeping count of how many hearts he had won with nothing more than a diamond bracelet or a promise he had no intention of keeping. That night at a private dinner with 3 of his closest men, the conversation had drifted toward women as it often did. Marcus Doyle, his oldest friend and second in command, had laughed and said that Daniel had never once failed to win over a woman he wanted. Daniel had smiled, agreeing without hesitation because it was simply true. Money always worked. Money always won. It was Marcus who brought up the trattoria. There was a small restaurant 2 streets from the harbor, tucked between a shuttered bookstore and a laundromat, that had somehow survived for 6 years despite every attempt by Daniel's company to buy the land beneath it. The woman who owned it, a chef named Grace Bennett, had refused every offer that had ever been sent her way, no matter how generous. She had turned down cash offers that would have set her up for life. She had ignored threats disguised as business proposals. She had even refused a meeting with Daniel's lawyers, sending back a handwritten note that simply said the restaurant was not for sale, and it never would be. Marcus mentioned her name mostly as a joke, a passing comment about stubborn people who did not understand how the world worked. But something in the way he described her caught in Daniel's mind and would not let go. A woman who could not be bought. A woman who did not want what he had to offer. He had never met anyone like that, not once in his entire life. Daniel leaned back in his chair, turning his wine glass slowly between his fingers, and asked Marcus what she looked like. Marcus shrugged and said she was nothing special to look at. A heavy-set woman, older than the girls Daniel usually kept company with, always covered in flour and sauce stains, with wild curly hair she never bothered to style. She ran her restaurant with an iron will and a temper to match, and everyone in the neighborhood adored her for it. The other men at the table laughed, assuming the conversation would end there. But Daniel did not laugh. Instead, he set his glass down and said, quite calmly, that there was no woman alive who could not be bought. Every person had a price, he said. Some prices were higher than others, but they all existed. He had simply never encountered one large enough to matter. Marcus, perhaps testing his friend, or perhaps simply enjoying the moment, leaned forward and said that Grace Bennett might be the exception. He said it with a grin, the kind of grin that dared a man like Daniel to prove himself wrong. That grin was what led to the shattered glass. Not because Daniel was upset with Marcus, but because the idea itself had lodged into his chest like a splinter, and he could not shake the feeling of it. A woman who did not want his money. A woman who had said no to him without ever meeting him. It felt impossible. It felt insulting. And within a few days, it felt like something he needed to prove wrong with his own hands. He told himself it was simply business, an amusing diversion from the pressure of everything else weighing on him that season. 2 of his shipments had been delayed at the border. A rival family, led by a man named Vincent Cole, had been making quiet moves into territory that had belonged to Daniel's family for over a decade. There were whispers of betrayal among his own men, though nothing solid enough yet to act on. Daniel needed something simple, something he could win easily, something that would remind him he was still the man who always got what he wanted. So on a quiet Tuesday evening, wearing a plain gray coat, instead of his usual tailored suits, and giving the driver the night off so he could walk the 2 streets alone, Daniel Hart went to find the trattoria that refused to sell. The restaurant was smaller than he expected, warm light spilling from its windows onto the wet pavement outside. There was no sign announcing anything fancy, just a simple wooden board that read Bennett's Kitchen in faded gold letters. Through the window, Daniel could see a handful of tables filled with regular customers, laughing and eating as though the outside world did not exist. It was nothing like the restaurants he usually visited, the ones with white tablecloths and silent waiters who never met his eyes. This place smelled like garlic and warm bread even from outside the door, and something about that smell made him hesitate for just a moment before he stepped inside. The moment he walked through the door, a bell above it rang softly, and the warmth of the room hit him like a wave. Every table was full except for a small one near the kitchen window, and he took it without waiting to be shown. A young waitress, no older than 20, hurried over with a menu and a nervous smile, clearly unused to seeing a man like him in such simple clothing sit so comfortably among the regulars. Daniel ordered without really looking at the menu, choosing whatever the waitress recommended, and settled back to watch the room. It did not take him long to notice her. Grace Bennett moved through the open kitchen with a kind of confidence that Daniel rarely saw, even among his own men. She was exactly as Marcus had described, a heavy-set woman with wild curls pulled back loosely, flour dusted across her apron, her sleeves rolled up to reveal strong, capable arms. She barked instructions to her small kitchen staff with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times, tasting sauces from the tip of a wooden spoon, laughing at something one of her cooks said, correcting a plate before it went out with a sharp but affectionate word. She was not glamorous. She was not polished. But there was something magnetic about the way she commanded that small kitchen, something Daniel had never encountered in the polished, careful women who usually surrounded him. When his food arrived, he understood immediately why people filled every seat in this small, unremarkable restaurant. It was, without question, the best meal he had eaten in years. Rich, warm, made with a kind of care that could not be faked or bought at any price. He found himself eating slower than he meant to, savoring each bite, momentarily forgetting the reason he had come. It was near the end of the meal that Grace herself came out from the kitchen to check on her guests, moving from table to table with easy familiarity, asking regulars about their families, laughing at old jokes, refilling water glasses herself when the young waitress fell behind. When she reached Daniel's table, she paused for a moment longer than she had at the others, studying him with open curiosity. "New face," she said, her voice warm but direct. "Don't think I've seen you around here before." Daniel offered his most practiced smile, the one that had charmed countless women before her, and told her the food had been extraordinary. He introduced himself with a false name, calling himself simply Daniel without offering his last name, and complimented her cooking with genuine sincerity, which surprised even himself. Grace seemed pleased but not particularly impressed by his charm. She thanked him plainly, told him to come back any time, and moved on to the next table without lingering the way most people did around him. She did not ask what he did for work. She did not glance at his watch or his shoes the way women usually did, calculating his worth before deciding how much attention to give him. She simply treated him like any other customer who had walked through her door, and something about that indifference unsettled him more than any rejection ever had. Before he left that night, Daniel left an enormous tip tucked beneath his plate, far more than the meal could have possibly cost. He told himself it was a test, a way to see if money alone might catch her attention where charm had failed. He walked out into the cool night air feeling strangely unsettled, replaying the evening in his mind more than he cared to admit. The following morning, Marcus brought him an envelope. Inside was the exact amount of the tip Daniel had left, along with a short note written in neat, sharp handwriting. "We don't accept charity here. Come back and pay what the meal is worth, or don't come back at all. Daniel read the note 3 times before setting it down on his desk. He felt something he rarely felt anymore, a kind of surprise that bordered on excitement. No one had ever returned his money before. No one had ever dared to. That afternoon, he called Marcus into his office and told him, quite seriously, that he intended to win this bet properly. Not through his usual methods of intimidation or business pressure, but through patience. He would go back to the restaurant, again and again if necessary, until Grace Bennett accepted his money and in doing so proved that his belief about the world was correct. Everyone had a price. He simply had to find hers. Marcus warned him gently that this was not a wise use of his time, especially with tensions rising around Vincent Cole's territory and the uncertainty among his own men. But Daniel waved away the concern. This felt different from the endless pressure of his usual life. It felt strangely like a game he actually wanted to play. Over the following days, Daniel found himself thinking about the trattoria far more often than he expected. He thought about the way Grace had moved through her kitchen, completely in control, completely herself, without a hint of performance for anyone watching. He thought about the note she had sent back with his money, the boldness required to return an amount that most people would have gladly kept. He found himself curious about a woman for the first time in longer than he could remember, not because of how she looked or what she could offer him, but because of how thoroughly she seemed to not need anything from him at all. He returned to Bennett's kitchen 3 days later, this time paying the exact price listed on the menu, down to the last coin, along with a modest but reasonable tip that matched what any regular customer might leave. Grace noticed immediately, raising an eyebrow when the young waitress mentioned the exact change had been left at his table. She came by herself this time, sliding into the seat across from him without asking permission, something no one else would ever have dared to do in his presence. "Learned your lesson," she said, a small smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. Daniel found himself laughing, a genuine laugh that surprised him with how easily it came. He admitted, carefully choosing his words, that he had not expected to be caught so quickly. Grace told him plainly that she had been running this restaurant long enough to recognize when someone was trying to buy their way into her good graces, and that it never worked, no matter who tried it. There was something refreshing about the conversation that followed, easy and unguarded in a way Daniel rarely experienced. Grace asked him simple questions about where he was from, what kind of work he did, whether he had a family waiting for him somewhere. Daniel answered carefully, keeping his real life hidden behind vague half-truths, claiming to work in property investment, which was not entirely a lie. Grace did not press further, seemingly satisfied with whatever answers he gave, more interested in whether he had enjoyed his meal than in what he did to earn his living. Before he left that evening, Grace told him without any particular emotion that he was welcome back any time, so long as he understood the rules of her restaurant. No special treatment, no unnecessary tips, no trying to impress her with money she had never asked for. Daniel agreed easily, already certain in his mind that this would be simple, that patience and persistence would eventually wear down her resistance the way it always did with everyone else. He had no idea, walking out into the cool evening air that night, that the woman he intended to conquer with nothing more than time and money was about to become the first person in his entire adult life who would make him question everything he believed about what people truly wanted and what money could actually buy. As the days passed, Daniel found himself returning to Bennett's kitchen more often than his original plan required. He told himself each visit was strategic, another small step in winning his bet with Marcus, another opportunity to study Grace Bennett and find the crack in her resistance. But somewhere beneath the surface of his own careful reasoning, something else was happening, something he was not yet ready to name. He began noticing small details about her that had nothing to do with his original goal. The way she hummed quietly to herself while chopping vegetables, completely unaware that anyone was listening. The way she scolded her young kitchen staff with sharp words but always followed with a gentle pat on the shoulder, softening every correction with obvious affection. The way she remembered small details about her regular customers, asking about a sick relative or a job interview weeks after the original conversation, proving that her warmth was not a performance but simply who she was. None of these observations fit neatly into his plan to prove that everyone had a price. If anything, they complicated it, adding layers to a woman he had originally dismissed as a simple obstacle to overcome. Daniel Hart, a man who built his entire identity around control and certainty, found himself increasingly uncertain about what he actually wanted from Grace Bennett, and that uncertainty followed him home each night, sitting heavy in his chest long after he had left the warm glow of her small restaurant behind. Meanwhile, in the world he had left behind for those brief evening hours, pressure continued to build. Vincent Cole's men had been spotted near the harbor twice that week, testing boundaries that had remained untouched for years. Marcus grew increasingly frustrated with how much time Daniel spent away from matters that actually required his attention, though he said little, sensing that his friend was working through something he did not yet fully understand himself. Daniel told himself again and again that this was simply a bet he intended to win, nothing more. But each time he sat across from Grace Bennett, watching her laugh freely, speak honestly, and move through her small kitchen with a confidence that had nothing to do with money or power, he found that winning felt less important than simply being there, in that warm, garlic-scented room, with a woman who saw him as nothing more than a man who appreciated good food and honest conversation. He did not yet know how deeply this would change him, or how dangerous it would become for both of them once the two separate worlds he was standing between finally collided. For now, all he knew was that he intended to return to Bennett's kitchen again the following evening, and the evening after that, telling himself each time that it was simply part of the plan, even as some quiet, unfamiliar part of him began to suspect it was becoming something else entirely. Grace Bennett had learned a long time ago that men who wore expensive coats and paid in exact change were either testing her or hiding something. Daniel fell into the second category, and it took her only a handful of visits to become certain of it. Still, she found herself looking forward to the evenings he appeared at his usual small table near the kitchen window, and that surprised her more than she cared to admit. Grace was 35 years old and had built Bennett's kitchen from nothing after her mother passed away, and left her a small inheritance, and a family recipe book filled with stains and handwritten notes in the margins. She had poured everything into that restaurant, working 18-hour days for the first 2 years, sleeping on a cot in the storage room more nights than she liked to remember. She had turned down offer after offer from developers who wanted to tear down her building and replace it with something shinier and more profitable, and she had done so without a single moment of regret. This restaurant was not simply a business to her. It was her mother's memory, kept alive in every dish she served. She had heard rumors, of course, about the company that kept trying to buy her land, whispers among neighborhood shop owners about how dangerous the men behind it truly were. She had dismissed most of it as exaggeration, the kind of gossip that spread easily in a tight-knit community. But something about Daniel, despite his easy smile and generous tips, made her wonder occasionally if there was more beneath the surface than he let on. Still, she found herself drawn to him in ways she could not fully explain. He listened when she spoke, really listened, in a way most people never bothered to. He asked questions about her recipes, her mother, the stories behind certain dishes, and seemed genuinely interested in the answers rather than simply making polite conversation. He never once commented on her weight or her appearance the way other men sometimes did, either through cruel jokes or backhanded compliments disguised as flattery. He simply treated her like a person worth knowing, and after years of being overlooked by men who preferred women who fit a narrower idea of beauty, that simple respect meant more to Grace than she wanted to acknowledge, even to herself. One evening, after the last customers had left and her kitchen staff had gone home, Daniel lingered at his table longer than usual, watching as Grace wiped down the counters and prepared the kitchen for the next day. Without really thinking about it, she poured 2 glasses of the cheap red wine she kept for staff meals and brought one over to his table, sitting down across from him for the first time outside of her usual quick check-ins between customers. They talked for hours that night, about nothing in particular and everything at once. Grace told him about her mother, about the small apartment above the restaurant where she had grown up smelling garlic and tomatoes drifting up through the floorboards every evening. She told him about the fear she still carried, even after 6 successful years, that everything could disappear overnight if she made one wrong decision. Daniel listened with an intensity that surprised her, occasionally sharing small pieces of his own life, though she noticed he was always careful, always vague about the details that mattered most. She should have found that evasiveness suspicious. Perhaps some part of her did, but there was something in the way he looked at her, something unguarded and almost startled, as though he was discovering something about himself in real time that he had not expected to find, that made her set aside her usual caution. As the weeks passed, their evenings together became a quiet routine, though neither of them ever named it as anything more than friendship. Daniel would arrive just as the dinner rush began to slow, taking his usual table, and by the time the last customers left, he and Grace would find themselves in easy conversation that stretched later and later into the night. Word spread among her small staff, gentle teasing that Grace brushed off with practiced ease, though she could not entirely deny the flutter of something unfamiliar whenever Daniel walked through her door. There were moments, small and easy to overlook, that hinted at the world Daniel came from. A phone call he stepped outside to take, his voice suddenly sharp and commanding in a way that did not match the man she had come to know. A driver who occasionally waited outside in a car that looked far too expensive for a simple property investor. A watchfulness in his eyes sometimes, as though he was always calculating threats even in the safety of her small, warm restaurant. Grace noticed these things, filed them away quietly, and chose, for reasons she did not fully examine, not to ask too many questions. Perhaps she told herself that everyone had secrets. Perhaps some part of her simply did not want to disturb the fragile, comfortable thing growing between them by pressing too hard against its edges. Whatever the reason, she allowed Daniel Hart further into her life than she had allowed anyone in years, never once suspecting how far the truth actually stretched beyond the careful, curated version of himself he presented to her. For Daniel, those evenings became something he genuinely looked forward to, separate from any plan or bet or point he had originally intended to prove. He found himself thinking about Grace throughout his day, wondering what she might be cooking, what stories she might share that evening, whether she would laugh at something he said in that full, unguarded way that made the corners of her eyes crinkle. He began, slowly and almost against his own will, to care about her opinion of him more than he cared about winning any bet with Marcus. This shift did not go unnoticed within his organization. Marcus grew increasingly concerned, watching his friend disappear most evenings to a small restaurant that had nothing to offer their business except a growing distraction. He raised the issue carefully one afternoon, reminding Daniel that Vincent Cole's men had grown bolder in recent weeks, testing the edges of territory that had remained undisputed for years. Daniel, uncharacteristically defensive, dismissed the concern, insisting he had everything under control, though even he was beginning to sense that his attention had drifted somewhere it had never gone before. The truth was, Daniel had begun to lose interest in proving anything to Marcus at all. What had started as an arrogant bet had transformed, slowly and without his full awareness, into something that felt startlingly close to genuine affection. He found himself wanting Grace's approval, not because it would prove his theory correct, but because her opinion of him had somehow become important in its own right, separate from anything he had originally set out to achieve. One night, sitting across from her long after closing, Daniel found himself on the verge of telling her the truth about who he really was. The words gathered in his throat, heavy and dangerous, as he watched her laugh at something he had said, her whole face lighting up in a way that made his chest ache with something unfamiliar. But at the last moment, fear stopped him, an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. Fear that the truth would end everything before it had truly begun. Fear that the warmth in her eyes would turn to something else entirely, once she understood the world he actually belonged to. So he said nothing, swallowing the confession along with the last of his wine, and told himself there would be time later, once he was certain of her feelings, once the risk felt smaller than it did in that moment. He did not yet understand how quickly that window of time was closing, or how the two separate lives he had been so carefully keeping apart were already beginning to bleed into one another, whether he was ready for it or not. Grace, for her part, found herself falling into something she had not expected or planned for. She had built walls around her heart over the years, tired of men who either wanted her money, her restaurant, or a version of companionship that never seemed to include real affection for who she actually was. Daniel had slipped past those walls slowly, patiently, without her fully realizing it was happening until it already had. She told her closest friend, a fellow shop owner named Lucy Marsh who ran the flower stand 2 doors down, about the strange, gentle man who had become part of her evenings. Lucy, ever practical, warned her to be careful, reminding Grace that men who kept secrets rarely kept only one. Grace laughed off the warning at the time, though some quiet part of her filed it away, a small seed of doubt that would not fully take root until much later, when it was already far too late to matter. For now, she allowed herself to enjoy the warmth of those evenings, the easy laughter, the way Daniel looked at her as though she were the only person in the room worth seeing. She did not yet know the danger gathering just beyond the edges of her small, warm kitchen, danger that had nothing to do with her cooking or her business, and everything to do with the man she had allowed herself to care for, despite every instinct that had once warned her to remain cautious. Neither of them could have known, in those quiet, golden evenings filled with easy conversation and cheap red wine, how quickly everything was about to change, or how the truth Daniel had been avoiding would soon arrive at Grace's door whether he was ready to speak it or not. The knock on the restaurant door came just after midnight, long after Grace had locked up and turned off the lights in the front room. She had been upstairs in her small apartment, still awake, thinking about the conversation she and Daniel had shared earlier that evening, when the sound of breaking glass downstairs sent her heart into her throat. She rushed down the narrow staircase, flipping on the lights just in time to see the front window of Bennett's kitchen shattered across the floor, shards glittering under the dim overhead bulbs. A brick sat in the middle of the mess, and taped around it was a single folded note. With trembling hands, Grace picked it up and unfolded it, reading the short, cold message printed in plain block letters. "Stop seeing him, or next time it will not be a window." Grace stood frozen in the wreckage of her front room, glass crunching beneath her bare feet, trying to make sense of words that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. She did not understand who had done this or why, only that the warning was unmistakably tied to Daniel, the man she had spent the last several weeks growing closer to without ever fully understanding who he truly was. She called him without hesitation, her voice shaking as she explained what had happened. Within 20 minutes, Daniel arrived at her restaurant, no longer wearing the plain gray coat he usually wore for their evenings together, but dressed in a dark, sharp suit that made him look like an entirely different man. 2 other men accompanied him, standing near the door with a watchfulness that unsettled Grace immediately, their eyes scanning the street outside as though danger might appear at any moment. Daniel knelt among the broken glass, picking up the note with careful fingers, his jaw tightening as he read the message. When he looked up at Grace, something had shifted in his expression, a hardness she had never seen from him before, alongside something that looked uncomfortably close to guilt. He told her, finally, the truth. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. He explained that his business dealings were more complicated and more dangerous than she understood, that there were rival groups who did not take kindly to weaknesses being exposed, and that his growing closeness to her had apparently been noticed by people who wished to use it against him. He did not use the words she needed to hear most clearly, words like crime or danger or mafia, choosing instead vague, careful language that still managed to communicate the seriousness of what he was admitting. Grace felt the floor tilt beneath her, though she remained standing among the broken glass. She had known, somewhere in the quiet corners of her mind, that Daniel carried secrets. She had chosen, deliberately, not to examine them too closely, telling herself that everyone deserved privacy, that the warmth between them was more important than whatever complicated business dealings occupied his daytime hours. But standing there, staring at a note that threatened her safety over a relationship she had barely allowed herself to name, she understood with sudden clarity how much she had been avoiding. She asked him directly, her voice steadier than she felt, exactly what kind of business he was truly involved in. Daniel hesitated, the silence stretching long enough that it answered her question before he ever spoke a word. When he finally admitted the truth, carefully but honestly, that he led an organization involved in activities far outside the boundaries of ordinary business, Grace felt something inside her chest crack open. She had built her entire life around honesty and hard work, around the belief that good things came from patience and integrity rather than shortcuts or fear. She had turned down every offer from his company over the years precisely because something about those offers had always felt wrong, though she had never known exactly why until this moment, standing in her own shattered restaurant, finally understanding that the man she had been falling for was connected to exactly the kind of danger she had spent years trying to keep away from her door. Daniel tried to explain further, his voice uncharacteristically pleading as he described how he had never meant for any of this to touch her, how he had genuinely believed he could keep his two worlds separate, how the feelings he had developed for her over these past weeks were more real than anything he had experienced in years. Grace listened, tears gathering but refusing to fall, torn between the anger she felt at having been deceived and the ache of recognizing sincerity in his voice despite everything. She told him, finally, that she needed him to leave. Not forever, she clarified, though even she was not entirely certain what she meant by that qualification. She simply needed time, space to process what had happened, to understand what kind of danger she had unknowingly welcomed into her life, and to decide whether whatever she felt for him was worth the risk that now sat undeniably between them. Daniel left reluctantly, though not before assigning 2 of his men to watch the restaurant discreetly through the remainder of the night, a decision Grace neither approved of nor had the energy to argue against in that exhausted, overwhelmed moment. She spent the rest of the night sweeping glass from her floor, her hands steady even as her mind raced through everything she had just learned, replaying every small clue she had ignored over the past several weeks, every careful evasion she had allowed to pass without question. The following morning, Grace called Lucy, her voice flat and exhausted as she explained everything that had happened. Lucy arrived within the hour, helping her board up the broken window with plywood while listening to the full story unfold. Lucy did not say she had warned her, though the words hung unspoken between them, evident in the careful, worried way she looked at her friend throughout the morning. Grace closed the restaurant for 2 days, an unprecedented decision that worried her regular customers and left her small staff confused and concerned. She spent those days largely alone in her apartment above the darkened restaurant, staring at the ceiling, trying to untangle the complicated knot of fear, anger, and lingering affection that refused to resolve itself no matter how many times she turned it over in her mind. Meanwhile, Daniel's world had shifted into a different kind of urgency entirely. The threat against Grace had come, as he suspected almost immediately, from Vincent Cole's organization, a calculated move meant to destabilize Daniel by exposing and threatening the one soft spot he had allowed to develop in recent weeks. Marcus confirmed his suspicions within a day, tracing the message back to a group of men loosely connected to Cole's growing operation near the harbor. Daniel called an emergency meeting with his closest men, the warmth and ease of recent weeks entirely replaced by the sharp, focused intensity that had built his reputation in the first place. He made it clear, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, that anyone connected to threatening Grace Bennett would face severe consequences. Marcus, though relieved to see his friend's old focus return, could not help but notice how personal this had become, how far beyond simple business this situation had grown. Over the following days, Daniel worked to trace the exact source of the threat while simultaneously wrestling with the damage done to his relationship with Grace. He sent no messages, respecting the space she had asked for, though the restraint cost him more than he expected. Each evening that passed without seeing her felt like a physical ache, an absence that made him understand, with startling clarity, exactly how much she had come to mean to him over these past weeks. He learned, through careful investigation, that Vincent Cole had been planning to expand into his territory for months, using increasingly aggressive tactics as his patience wore thin. The threat against Grace had been intended as a message, a way of demonstrating that Daniel's usual confidence and control had a vulnerability that could be exploited. Daniel understood the danger clearly now, not just to himself, but to Grace, whose safety had become tangled into a conflict she had never asked to be part of. He debated, for the first time in longer than he could remember, what the right course of action truly was. His old instincts urged him toward immediate and forceful retaliation, a swift demonstration of power that would eliminate the threat and restore the balance that had existed before Cole's men grew bold. But another part of him, the part that had spent weeks laughing quietly with Grace over cheap red wine, worried that any dramatic action would only draw her further into danger, further into a world she had made clear she wanted no part of. Marcus, watching his friend wrestle with this uncharacteristic hesitation, finally spoke plainly one evening, telling Daniel that he had never seen him so conflicted about a decision before. Daniel admitted, quietly and with more vulnerability than he usually allowed himself, that he did not know how to protect Grace without becoming exactly the kind of man she had every reason to fear. Grace, meanwhile, reopened her restaurant on the third day, unable to bear the financial strain and emotional weight of remaining closed any longer. Her regular customers returned with concerned questions about the boarded window, which she answered vaguely, citing an accident rather than revealing the truth of what had actually happened. She threw herself into her work with fierce determination, using the familiar rhythm of chopping vegetables and stirring sauces to keep her mind from wandering too far into the uncertainty that had settled over her life. But despite her best efforts, thoughts of Daniel crept in constantly. She missed their easy conversations, the warmth of his attention, the way he had made her feel seen in a way few people ever had. She hated herself, a little, for missing him despite everything she had learned, for the way her heart still ached every evening around the time he would normally arrive, only to remain empty, his usual table sitting conspicuously vacant. Lucy checked in on her daily, offering quiet support without pushing too hard for decisions Grace clearly was not ready to make. She reminded Grace, gently but firmly, that whatever she decided, her safety needed to come first, that no amount of affection was worth risking her life or her restaurant over. Grace knew Lucy was right, logically, in the careful way she knew most difficult truths were right even when her heart resisted accepting them. But logic had little power over the ache that settled into her chest each night, the quiet wondering about what Daniel was doing, whether he was safe, whether the danger that had shattered her window was still circling somewhere out in the dark. 1 week after the incident, as Grace was closing up for the night, she found an envelope slipped beneath her door, containing no note, only a substantial amount of money meant to cover the cost of her broken window and the days of lost business. There was no signature, no explanation, though she recognized immediately whose careful, guilty conscience had sent it. She stared at the money for a long moment, torn between the instinct to return it as she always had before, and the recognition that this gesture felt different from his earlier attempts to win her over with wealth. This was not an attempt to buy her affection. This was, she suspected, an apology delivered in the only language Daniel truly understood how to speak fluently. She set the envelope aside, unable yet to decide what to do with it, unable yet to decide what to do about the larger, more complicated question of what she felt for the dangerous, secretive man who had somehow become tangled into the center of her carefully ordered life. She did not yet know that Daniel was preparing to make a choice far more significant than any envelope of money could represent. A choice that would require him to risk everything he had built in order to prove that his feelings for her were real, and that some things, despite everything he had always believed, truly could not be bought. Vincent Cole's headquarters sat on the far side of the harbor, in a converted warehouse that had once processed fish before it began processing considerably more dangerous cargo. Daniel arrived alone, against every piece of advice Marcus had offered, insisting that this conversation needed to happen without an audience of armed men standing behind either side of the table. Cole met him in a sparse upstairs office, a wiry man in his 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He did not bother with pleasantries, gesturing for Daniel to sit, while making it clear from his posture that he had little patience for a long conversation. Daniel matched his directness, laying out plainly that he knew about the threat against Grace Bennett, that he understood it had been intended to destabilize him, and that he had come to discuss terms rather than retaliation. Cole seemed almost amused by this approach, leaning back in his chair and asking why Daniel would choose diplomacy over the forceful response everyone expected from him. Daniel answered honestly, surprising even himself with the directness of his response. He explained that an escalation of violence would only endanger Grace further, and that he was willing to make significant concessions regarding territory near the harbor if it meant guaranteeing her safety permanently, removing her entirely from any future conflict between their organizations. The negotiation that followed stretched over nearly 2 hours, filled with careful, tense exchanges, as both men worked to find terms that satisfied their respective interests without triggering a war that would have devastated both organizations. Daniel gave up more than he had ever imagined he would, ceding control of profitable shipping routes that had taken years to establish, in exchange for Cole's absolute guarantee that Grace and her restaurant would remain untouched, regardless of whatever happened between Daniel and herself in the future. Marcus, waiting anxiously outside the warehouse, could hardly believe it when Daniel emerged unharmed, informing him quietly of the concessions he had made. It was, by any measure within their world, an enormous sacrifice, the kind of decision that would have been unthinkable for Daniel only a few months earlier. Marcus asked, carefully, whether it had truly been worth it. Daniel did not hesitate before answering that it was, though he could not fully explain, even to his closest friend, exactly why protecting Grace Bennett's safety had become worth more to him than territory he had spent his entire adult life building and defending. With the immediate danger resolved, Daniel faced an entirely different challenge, one that felt in many ways more difficult than any negotiation with a rival boss. He needed to find a way back into Grace's life, not through money or power, both of which had failed spectacularly already, but through something he had rarely offered anyone in his adult life: complete, unguarded honesty. He returned to Bennett's kitchen on a quiet Wednesday evening, nearly 2 weeks after the night the window had shattered, wearing his usual plain gray coat rather than the sharp suits he had worn during his negotiations with Cole. He arrived without the men who usually accompanied him, without any of the careful, calculated protection that normally surrounded his movements, choosing instead to walk in alone and vulnerable, exactly as he had the very first evening he stepped through her door. The restaurant was quieter than usual, only a handful of tables occupied as the evening rush began to wind down. Grace spotted him immediately from across the room, her hands stilling over the pot she had been stirring, her expression unreadable as she watched him approach the counter rather than his usual table. She did not smile, though she also did not turn him away, simply waiting with careful patience as he gathered whatever words he had come to say. Daniel spoke plainly, without the practiced charm he usually relied on, telling her everything he had done over the past 2 weeks. He explained the negotiation with Cole, the territory he had given up, the concessions made entirely to guarantee her safety without her ever needing to worry about danger touching her life again because of him. He told her, his voice steady despite the vulnerability of the moment, that he understood if she never wanted to see him again, that he had brought danger into her world through his own carelessness, and that whatever she decided, he needed her to know the truth of who he was and what he had done, without any attempt to soften or hide it further. Grace listened silently, her expression giving little away, though Daniel could see the careful way she processed every word, weighing them against everything she had learned and felt over the past 2 weeks. When he finished speaking, a long silence stretched between them, filled only by the quiet clatter of dishes from the kitchen behind her. Finally Grace spoke, her voice quiet but steady. She told him that she appreciated his honesty, appreciated the risk he had taken by giving up so much for her safety. But she reminded him firmly that she had never asked for protection bought through violence or negotiated through territory she knew nothing about. She had built her entire life avoiding exactly the kind of world he came from, and she needed to understand, clearly and honestly, whether he was capable of truly changing, or whether this was simply another version of him trying to solve a problem the only way he knew how, through power and sacrifice rather than genuine transformation. Daniel had no easy answer for her, and rather than offering false promises, he admitted honestly that he did not fully know. He told her that he had spent his entire adult life building an identity around control and certainty, and that these past weeks with her had shown him, more clearly than anything else ever had, how empty that identity truly felt without someone who cared about him for reasons that had nothing to do with money or fear. He told her he wanted to try, genuinely try, to become someone worthy of the trust she had once given him so easily, though he understood that trust could not simply be demanded back after everything that had happened. Grace studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something she seemed uncertain whether she would find. Finally, she told him that she needed time, real time, not measured in days, but in the slow accumulation of trust rebuilt through consistent, honest actions rather than grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices. She was not ready to welcome him back fully, not yet, but she was willing, cautiously, to allow him to prove himself, one honest evening at a time. Daniel accepted this without argument, understanding it was more than he had any right to expect given everything that had happened. He left that evening without pressing for more, grateful simply for the small opening she had offered him, a chance to rebuild something that had been fractured by secrets and danger neither of them had fully anticipated when their strange friendship first began. Over the following weeks, Daniel returned to Bennett's kitchen faithfully, though everything about his approach had changed. He no longer arrived with expectations, no longer measured his visits against any hidden bet or plan. He simply showed up, evening after evening, taking his usual table near the kitchen window, ordering whatever Grace recommended, and offering nothing more than honest conversation and quiet patience. Grace remained cautious at first, keeping their interactions polite but guarded, unwilling to fall back into the easy warmth they had once shared without proof that Daniel truly intended to change. She noticed, gradually, small differences in how he carried himself. He seemed less watchful, less burdened by the constant calculation she now understood had always been running beneath his charm. He spoke more openly about his daily struggles, admitting difficulties within his organization as he worked to restructure his business away from its most dangerous elements, a transition Marcus had warned him would take years rather than months. Daniel never pushed for more than Grace was willing to give. He accepted her caution without complaint, understanding that trust, once broken, could not simply be rebuilt through words alone. Instead, he showed up consistently, reliably, allowing his actions to speak where his previous charm had once tried to substitute for genuine character. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the warmth between them began to return. Grace found herself laughing again during their evening conversations, the same easy, unguarded laughter that had first drawn her toward him months earlier. She noticed the careful way he now spoke about his work, the genuine effort he seemed to be making toward extracting himself from the more dangerous aspects of his business, even as he remained honest about how difficult and slow that process truly was. One evening, several weeks after his initial return, Daniel arrived carrying nothing but a small, worn notebook, setting it carefully on the table between them. He explained, somewhat nervously, that it contained recipes his own grandmother had once made, recipes he had not thought about in years until spending time in Grace's kitchen reminded him of flavors from his childhood he had long forgotten. He admitted, with unusual vulnerability, that he had never shared this notebook with anyone before, uncertain why he felt compelled to share it with her now beyond a simple desire to give her something real, something that had nothing to do with money or power. Grace accepted the notebook carefully, flipping through pages filled with faded handwriting and small, personal notes scrawled in the margins. She recognized immediately the significance of what he was offering her, a piece of himself that had nothing to do with wealth or influence, simply memory and vulnerability freely given. Something shifted in her expression as she looked up at him, a softening that had been absent since the night her window shattered. She told him, quietly, that she would try making one of the recipes for the following evening's special, if he was willing to help her in the kitchen while she worked. Daniel agreed immediately, and that evening marked a turning point neither of them fully recognized until much later, looking back on how naturally they fell into comfortable partnership, working side by side over a small stove as Grace guided his clumsy but earnest attempts at cooking, both of them laughing freely at his mistakes in a way that reminded them both of everything good that had existed between them before danger interrupted their fragile beginning. As months passed, Daniel continued the difficult work of restructuring his organization, gradually shifting toward legitimate business ventures under Marcus's careful guidance. It was slow, complicated work, filled with setbacks and resistance from men within his organization who preferred the old ways of doing business. But Daniel persisted, driven by a conviction that had grown stronger with each evening spent in Grace's warm, honest company, a conviction that the life he wanted to build required leaving behind the parts of himself that had once made genuine connection impossible. Grace, watching this transformation unfold gradually over many months, found her guarded heart slowly opening again, though she remained careful never to rush the process, understanding that real trust required real time to rebuild properly. She began sharing more of herself with him again, telling him stories about her mother, teaching him family recipes with the same patience she had once used to teach her earliest kitchen staff. Their relationship deepened naturally, built now on a foundation far sturdier than the one that had crumbled so quickly months earlier. Daniel learned to appreciate small things he had never noticed before, the particular satisfaction of a meal made with genuine care, the quiet joy found in ordinary evenings spent with someone who wanted nothing from him except his honest presence. Grace, in turn, learned that the man beneath the dangerous reputation she had once feared was capable of genuine tenderness, genuine effort, genuine change, so long as he was given the patience and honesty necessary to prove it. 1 year after the night Daniel Hart had first walked through the doors of Bennett's kitchen, intending only to win a careless bet with an old friend, he returned once more, though this visit carried none of the calculation that had defined his earliest evenings there. He arrived after closing time, having arranged with Grace's small staff to have the restaurant entirely to themselves for the evening. Grace found him standing near the same small table where they had shared their very first conversation, though the space had been transformed with simple, warm lighting and a single small vase of wildflowers. Nothing elaborate or expensive, simply thoughtful and genuine. He told her, his voice steady despite obvious nervousness, that he no longer had anything to offer her except himself, entirely and honestly, without the wealth or power that had once defined everything about how he approached the world. He explained that he had spent the past year learning something he had never understood before meeting her, that genuine respect and love could never be purchased, no matter how much money a person had access to, and that the only thing truly worth having was something freely given between two people who valued each other for exactly who they were, without pretense or calculation. Grace listened, tears gathering in her eyes as she recognized the profound distance he had traveled since that first arrogant bet had brought him stumbling into her small, unglamorous restaurant. She told him, her voice thick with emotion, that she had fallen in love with him not despite his flaws, but through watching him work honestly to overcome them, through witnessing firsthand that genuine change was possible when someone truly wanted it badly enough. They stood together in the warm, familiar space of her kitchen, surrounded by the scent of garlic and fresh bread that had first drawn Daniel through her door so many months earlier, both of them finally understanding that everything valuable in their lives together had grown not from wealth or power, but from patience, honesty, and the simple, stubborn refusal of one determined chef to ever accept anything less than genuine respect. Word of their relationship eventually spread through both of their separate worlds, surprising many who had known Daniel only as a ruthless, calculating businessman incapable of genuine sentiment. Marcus, watching his old friend's transformation with quiet satisfaction, often remarked that Grace Bennett had accomplished something no amount of money or influence had ever managed, teaching Daniel Hart the true value of things that could never be bought or sold. Grace's restaurant continued to thrive, its reputation growing not just for exceptional food, but for the warm, genuine atmosphere that had always defined it, an atmosphere Daniel now contributed to rather than threatened. He remained involved in her life fully and honestly, occasionally still awkward in the kitchen, but always willing to learn, always grateful for the ordinary evenings that had once seemed impossibly out of reach for a man who had spent his entire adult life believing everything, and everyone, had a price. Years later, when younger members of Daniel's now largely legitimate business asked him about the early days of his career, he would often mention, with a small, private smile, the arrogant bet that had once sent him walking through the doors of a small neighborhood restaurant, fully expecting to prove that money could buy anything he desired. He would tell them, honestly and without embarrassment, that he had lost that particular bet entirely, and that losing it remained the single greatest victory of his entire life. Grace Bennett never did sell her restaurant, not to Daniel's company all those years ago, and not to any of the other offers that occasionally still arrived from ambitious developers eager to claim the valuable harbor front land. She kept Bennett's kitchen exactly as her mother had always intended it to be, a warm, welcoming space built on hard work and genuine care rather than shortcuts or easy money. And every evening, as the dinner rush began to slow and the last golden light faded from the windows, Daniel Hart could still be found at the same small table near the kitchen window, watching the woman he loved move through her kitchen with the same fierce, capable confidence that had first captured his attention so many months earlier. Finally understanding, completely and without doubt, that some things in this world were worth far more than any price he could ever have offered to pay.